The ground shouldn't have whispered back, but it did, and that was the first thing Sergeant Marcus Caldwell noticed before everything changed. It was just after 600 hours on a cold morning training sweep outside Fort Riley, Kansas, where the wind rolled across the open field like an invisible tide, pushing dust and dry grass in slow motion. Frost, a white-coated German Shepherd K9 with pale amber eyes and a disciplined gait, suddenly stopped mid-step. No command triggered it. No sound from the radio. Just silence. Absolute, unnatural stillness. Marcus slowed behind him, boots pressing into packed dirt, noticing the way Frost's ears locked forward as if listening to something beneath the earth itself. "Easy, Frost," Marcus said calmly, voice low and steady, but the dog didn't move. That was the first problem. Frost always moved when told. Behind them, Corporal Jason Miller adjusted his field pack and scanned the perimeter. "We're still within the seismic advisory zone," Jason muttered, glancing at the handheld monitor. The display showed minor ground instability warnings, nothing serious enough to halt a sweep, yet Frost's behavior suggested otherwise. The K9 took one slow step forward, then another, nose dropping closer to the ground. He exhaled sharply, a soft whine caught between alert and warning. Marcus exchanged a look with Jason. It wasn't fear, not yet, but instinct had a way of speaking before logic caught up. The field ahead looked ordinary, just uneven terrain, patches of dry earth, scattered rock, and faded tire marks from previous patrols. But Frost's focus narrowed on a single point, a subtle depression in the soil no wider than a pickup truck. "Command said this sector was cleared yesterday," Jason said, though his voice had lost its certainty. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Frost circle the same spot twice, faster now, more insistent, claws scraping lightly at the dirt as if testing something hidden just beneath the surface. Then came the bark. One sharp, controlled burst. Not panic, not aggression. A signal. Marcus knelt slightly, brushing a hand over Frost's shoulder. The dog didn't break eye contact with the ground. "You're telling me something," Marcus whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The wind shifted, and for a brief moment, the earth seemed to sigh. A faint shift in the soil, almost imperceptible, like a breath held too long underground. Jason stepped closer. "If this is another false alert," he stopped mid-sentence. The ground beneath Frost's front paws gave a subtle crack, dry and hollow, like ice forming on thin glass. Both Marines froze. Frost immediately stepped back, ears high, body tense but controlled. Marcus raised a hand. "Back up." Slowly. Jason obeyed, boots shifting carefully as he moved away from the center point. The depression in the ground looked unchanged, yet now it felt different, like it no longer belonged to the surface world. Marcus keyed his radio. "Base command, this is Caldwell. Requesting geological support at grid sector Echo 7. Possible subsurface instability detected." Static answered first, then a delayed acknowledgement. Frost remained locked on the same spot, unmoving, as if guarding something unseen. Marcus studied him closely. He had worked with K9 units long enough to know the difference between training response and instinctive certainty. This was not routine. This was recognition. Something down there had triggered memory, or scent, or both. "What are you picking up?" Marcus murmured. Frost didn't answer in words, only shifted his weight forward again, cautious now, as if waiting for permission to reveal what the earth was hiding. And for the first time that morning, Marcus felt it too. Not sound, not sight, but the unsettling sense that the ground beneath them was no longer just ground. The silence that followed felt heavier than the wind itself, as if the entire field had paused to listen to something no human could yet understand. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stayed still for 3 full seconds, eyes fixed on the shallow depression Frost refused to leave. Around them, the open training zone stretched for nearly half a mile in every direction, broken only by sparse tufts of dry grass and the distant silhouette of utility poles swaying gently in the wind. Corporal Jason Miller lowered his binoculars and exhaled slowly. "Ground radar is not showing anything unusual," he said, though his tone no longer carried confidence. "If there is something here, it is not geological surface activity." Marcus did not respond immediately. Frost had moved again, this time lowering his head so close to the earth that his breath disturbed fine dust particles on the surface. The dog's posture had shifted from alert to something more deliberate, almost investigative, as if he were tracing a memory buried under layers of soil. Marcus had seen this before, in different environments, different missions, when AK-9 reacted not to what was visible, but to what was absent. "Get me confirmation from base engineering," Marcus finally said, voice calm but firm. Jason nodded and keyed his handheld communicator. Static crackled before a delayed voice returned, confirming that no excavation or structural work had ever been recorded in this sector. That answer should have ended the discussion, but it did not. Frost suddenly stopped circling and sat directly at the center of the depression. The movement was intentional, controlled, almost ceremonial. His pale amber eyes locked downward, unblinking. Marcus felt a shift in his chest, a quiet instinct telling him this was no longer about terrain assessment. "You are certain about this location?" Jason asked, stepping closer, careful not to cross the center point. Marcus crouched beside Frost, placing a steady hand on the dog's shoulder. "He is not reacting to surface conditions," Marcus said quietly. "He is reacting to something beneath it." The wind picked up slightly, carrying fine grains of dust that skittered across the uneven ground. Then, unexpectedly, Frost gave another single bark, sharper than before, followed by a brief scrape of his front paw. The sound was not random. It was directional. Marcus turned his head slightly, listening. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faint but distinct, came a low hollow echo when Jason shifted his boot nearby, as if the ground responded differently in that exact spot compared to the surrounding earth. Jason froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Marcus nodded once. Frost rose slowly, stepping backward now, positioning himself between Marcus and the center point, as if creating space for what came next. Marcus raised his radio again. "Command, update. We are requesting immediate ground-penetrating scan equipment. Possible subsurface void confirmed by acoustic response." A pause followed, longer this time. Frost remained perfectly still, except for his eyes, which continued to track the earth with unwavering focus. Marcus had worked with military K-9 units for over a decade, and he understood something most did not. Dogs did not imagine patterns. They responded to them. And whatever Frost was sensing, it was consistent, persistent, and intentional. Jason looked uneasy now, adjusting his grip on the field pack strap across his chest. "If there is a void under here," he said carefully, "it could be an old collapse zone, maybe even an abandoned structure." Marcus stood slowly, scanning the perimeter again. The terrain offered no clues, no surface indication of anything unusual. Yet Frost's behavior contradicted everything visible. The dog stepped forward again, stopping just short of the center, then lowered his head once more, nostrils flaring as he inhaled deeply. This time, he did not bark. He waited, as if listening for a response from beneath. Marcus felt the moment stretch, quiet and absolute, the kind of silence that presses against the ears rather than fills them. Jason lowered his voice. "Sir, we should maintain distance until engineering arrives." Marcus did not move his eyes from Frost. "We already are maintaining distance," he said. "He is telling us exactly where not to step." And as the wind rolled across the open field again, both men stood watching the white K-9, who remained fixed on the same invisible point in the earth, as though guarding a secret that had been waiting far longer than any of them had arrived to find it. The request for additional equipment had already been sent, but time felt like it had slowed in a way that made every second feel heavier than the last. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stood a few feet behind Frost, his eyes moving between the K-9 and the subtle depression in the ground that refused to behave like ordinary terrain. The wind across the Kansas field continued in steady waves, brushing low dust patterns across the surface, but in that specific circle of earth, even the dust seemed to settle differently, as if avoiding the center point entirely. Corporal Jason Miller checked his communicator again, frustration building in silence as the response from base continued to delay. "Engineering team is 20 minutes out," Jason said finally, lowering the device. Marcus nodded once without turning his head. Frost remained locked in place, unmoving, his posture now calm but intensely focused, as if he had already committed every sense to what lay beneath. Marcus crouched again, this time closer to the dog's line of sight. "What are you hearing down there?" he murmured quietly, not expecting an answer in words. but trusting the rhythm of behavior that had never failed him in the field. Frost did not respond to the question. Instead, he shifted slightly forward, then paused, as if reconsidering each movement with precision. Jason stepped closer to Marcus, keeping a cautious distance from the center point. "Sir, I am still not seeing any external indication of collapse risk," Jason said, though his tone had softened from certainty into uncertainty. Marcus raised a hand slightly, signaling silence. Something had changed. The ground itself seemed to carry a different quality of sound when the wind passed over it, like air moving across a hollow structure rather than solid earth. Marcus took a slow step to the side and knelt, pressing his palm lightly against the ground just outside the depression. At first, it felt normal, firm and dry, but as he held still, he noticed a faint vibration, subtle enough that it could have been dismissed as imagination if not for Frost's continued reaction. The K9 suddenly lifted his head and gave a single low whine, deeper than before, almost resonant, then turned slightly toward Marcus as if confirming he was no longer alone in his perception. Jason exhaled slowly. "This is not standard terrain behavior," he admitted. Marcus agreed silently, but did not speak it yet. He stood again, scanning the horizon, then the immediate ground, then Frost. The dog had now repositioned himself to the far edge of the depression, standing guard-like, his body angled outward as if protecting access to the center. Marcus keyed his communicator once more. "Base command, we are upgrading urgency. Request immediate arrival of structural assessment unit with subsurface imaging capability." A brief acknowledgement came through, but no immediate support followed. The delay stretched the moment further, pressing it into something almost tangible. Jason shifted his weight uneasily. "If there is something under there, it has been sealed or buried for a long time," he said. Marcus looked down at the ground again. "We're hidden," he replied quietly. Frost suddenly stepped forward again, breaking his own new position, and placed his front paw directly at the edge of the center point. The movement was deliberate and slow, not instinctive but intentional, as if marking a boundary that only he understood. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest, the kind that comes before confirmation of something that cannot be unseen once revealed. Jason followed Frost's gaze and frowned. "He is not just reacting anymore," Jason said. "He is leading." Marcus did not correct him. Instead, he watched as Frost leaned forward slightly, nostrils close to the ground again, and then froze. A faint sound carried through the wind at that exact moment. Not from above, but from below, a subtle echo like air shifting through a confined space. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Get ready," he said calmly. Jason looked at him. "For what exactly?" Marcus kept his eyes on Frost. "For whatever he has been trying to show us from the beginning." And in that moment, the field no longer felt empty, but waiting. The field had begun to feel less like open terrain and more like a paused moment in time, as if the world itself was holding its breath above something it did not want to reveal. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stood motionless beside Frost, his eyes locked on the exact point where the German shepherd refused to look away. The wind rolled across the Kansas plains in steady motion, yet the center of the depression remained strangely still, as if resisting even the smallest disturbance. Corporal Jason Miller checked his communicator again, then looked up with a tightened expression. "Engineering unit is still en route, approximately 15 minutes out," he said, his voice lower now, no longer carrying procedural confidence. Marcus gave a single nod, never taking his eyes off Frost. The K9 had shifted again, this time lowering his front half slightly, not in submission, but in preparation, like a soldier anticipating movement from an unseen source. Marcus had seen that posture before, in environments where danger was not immediate but imminent in a way that could not yet be measured. He slowly extended his hand toward Frost's collar, not to restrain him, but to steady the connection between them. "Stay with me," Marcus said quietly. Frost did not break focus. Jason stepped carefully closer to the perimeter of the depression, keeping his boots outside what felt like an invisible boundary. "Sir," Jason said after a moment, "if there is an underground void, we may be dealing with an old structural cavity or collapsed storage tunnel. There are no records of active construction in this sector." Marcus finally turned his head slightly toward him. "Not everything that exists is recorded," he replied. The words hung in the air longer than expected. Frost suddenly lifted his head and gave a low, sustained whine, different from before, not urgent, but deliberate, almost like a signal waiting for acknowledgement. Marcus felt it in his chest before he understood it in his mind. Something beneath them was responding, not loudly, not violently, but present. Jason crouched briefly and picked up a small stone, tossing it gently toward the center of the depression. The stone landed with a dull sound, but the echo that followed was not normal. It returned slightly delayed, hollow, as if the ground beneath absorbed and then released it. Jason froze. "That is not solid ground," he said quietly. Marcus stepped forward half a pace, then stopped himself. Frost immediately moved to intercept that motion, placing his body between Marcus and the center point, not aggressively, but firmly, as if establishing command of the space. The canine's behavior had now shifted from detection to protection. Marcus looked down at Frost. "You are guarding it now," he said softly, almost to himself. Frost did not move. The wind picked up briefly, brushing across the field, but at the depression's edge it seemed to split, as if flowing around something invisible. Jason adjusted the strap of his field pack, visibly uneasy. "We should establish a wider perimeter," he suggested. Marcus agreed with a slight motion of his hand, and Jason immediately began marking a safer distance with visible caution. Still, neither of them stepped away fully. Frost suddenly turned his head toward Marcus, making direct eye contact for the first time in several minutes. There was no confusion in his gaze, only certainty. Then, slowly, he looked back down at the ground and gave a single sharp bark. It was not loud, but it was final. Marcus felt the decision form before he voiced it. "We are not leaving this until we know what it is," he said. Jason nodded reluctantly. Frost stepped forward again, placing both front paws near the exact center point, then stopped. The ground beneath him did not collapse, but it responded in silence, as if acknowledging his presence. Marcus lowered his voice. "Whatever is down there," he said, "he already knows it is there." And for the first time since arriving, Marcus understood that they were no longer searching. They were being shown something that had been waiting far longer than they had. The wind across the open Kansas field had begun to change in character, no longer feeling like a natural breeze, but something that seemed to pass around a fixed point rather than through it. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell remained near Frost, his posture steady but alert, eyes constantly tracking the subtle depression in the ground. The German shepherd had not moved from his position at the edge of the center point, except for small adjustments in stance, each one precise and intentional, as if calibrating his presence to something unseen beneath the surface. Corporal Jason Miller checked the horizon again, then his communicator, then the ground, repeating the cycle as if searching for a version of reality that made more sense than the one unfolding in front of him. "Engineering unit is 10 minutes out," Jason said, his voice quieter than before, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever balance existed in the soil. Marcus gave a slow nod, never breaking focus. Frost suddenly lifted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he took in the air, then exhaled in a controlled breath that sounded almost like restraint rather than alert. Marcus had seen detection behavior before, but this was different. This was not pursuit. This was recognition. Jason moved carefully along the perimeter line he had begun marking, placing small flags into the dirt to define a safe observation boundary. The ground itself appeared unchanged, yet every step Jason took felt increasingly deliberate, as if the surface required negotiation rather than simple contact. Marcus crouched again, this time placing both knees firmly into the soil just outside Frost's position. He pressed his palm flat against the earth and held it there for several seconds. At first there was nothing, only dryness and warmth from the sun above. But then, faintly, a second sensation emerged, not vibration in the traditional sense, but a subtle pressure differential, like air moving in and out of a confined space far below. Marcus lifted his hand slowly. "It is breathing," he said quietly without realizing he had spoken aloud. Jason looked up immediately. "Sir." Marcus did not repeat himself. Frost suddenly shifted his weight forward, then back again, as if responding to the same sensation. The dog gave a low, controlled whine, not of distress, but of confirmation. Marcus stood slowly, scanning the depression again. The center point remained visually unremarkable, Yet the perception of it had changed entirely. It no longer felt like ground. It felt like a threshold. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles finally broke the field's unnatural stillness. The engineering unit had arrived. 2 utility trucks rolled to a stop at the edge of the training zone, and personnel began unloading ground scanning equipment with measured urgency. A senior engineer stepped forward, greeting Marcus with a brief nod before assessing the marked perimeter. "What are we looking at?" the engineer asked. Marcus responded without hesitation. "Subsurface void with acoustic echo response confirmed. K9 unit has consistent behavioral lock on center point." The engineer studied Frost for a moment, noting the animal's unwavering focus. "K9 is source confirmed?" he asked. Marcus shook his head slightly. "K9 is indicator, not source." The engineer nodded and signaled for the scanning unit to be deployed. As equipment was positioned, Frost suddenly shifted again, stepping 1 pace forward into the exact center of the depression. Marcus reacted immediately, extending a hand. "Hold position," he said calmly but firmly. Frost stopped, then slowly turned his head toward Marcus. There was no tension in the movement, only certainty, as if waiting for acknowledgement before proceeding further. Jason moved closer to Marcus. "If the ground is unstable, we need to proceed carefully," he said. Marcus agreed with a slight motion, but his eyes remained fixed on Frost. The scanning device was activated, emitting a low electronic pulse that traveled into the earth. For a brief moment, everything remained still. Then the device emitted a subtle change in tone, a shift in frequency that caused the engineer to pause and adjust the calibration. He leaned closer to the display. "We have a cavity," he said quietly, "approximately 12 to 15 feet below surface. Irregular shape." Marcus exhaled slowly, absorbing the confirmation. Frost sat down again at the edge of the center point, calm now, as if his role had transitioned from warning to witnessing. Jason looked between the screen and the ground. "So it is real," he said softly. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at Frost and then at the ground beneath them. "It has been real for a long time," he finally said. The wind passed again across the field, but this time it felt different, less like resistance and more like movement around something that had always been there. And as the team prepared for next steps, Frost remained perfectly still, watching the earth as if it had finally begun to speak back. The engineering team had fully arrived now, and the field outside. Fort Riley felt less like an open training zone and more like a controlled operations space defined by caution and precision. Portable ground imaging units had been set into a wide triangular formation around the marked depression, each device emitting a low, rhythmic pulse that traveled into the earth in carefully measured intervals. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stood just behind the safety line with Frost at his side, the German shepherd now calmer in posture, but no less focused, his pale amber eyes still locked on the same central point as if nothing in the world beyond it existed. Corporal Jason Miller moved between technicians, relaying positioning instructions while glancing repeatedly at the live feed from the scanning unit. The engineer in charge, a middle-aged man with a calm but analytical demeanor, studied the shifting data on a portable display screen. "We are getting a clearer profile now," he said, adjusting the frequency range. "The void is larger than initial estimate. Irregular cavity, likely man-made or partially collapsed structure." Marcus stepped slightly closer to the display, his expression unchanged but intent. "Depth?" he asked. The engineer checked the calibration once more. "Between 15 and 18 feet, possibly deeper in one section. There are density inconsistencies suggesting layered material below the cavity." Frost suddenly lifted his head, ears tightening forward. The reaction was immediate and subtle, as if the dog had heard something no machine had yet translated. Marcus noticed it instantly. "Hold the scan frequency steady," Marcus instructed. The engineer complied, and the next pulse sent into the ground returned a slightly altered echo pattern, sharper, more defined. Jason frowned. "That is not a natural collapse zone," he said quietly. "There is structure down there." Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Frost, who had taken a single step forward again, stopping exactly at the same central point he had refused to abandon since the beginning. The dog lowered his head, nostrils close to the soil, and exhaled slowly. Marcus knelt beside him. "You knew before any of us did," Marcus said softly. almost in acknowledgement rather than observation. Frost remained still. The engineer raised his voice slightly. "We are getting metallic reflection beneath the void layer," he said. "Not uniform. There are segments of reinforced material, possibly remnants of storage infrastructure or sealed containment." Jason looked up sharply. "Military." The engineer hesitated. "Cannot confirm yet, but the composition suggests human construction beneath natural soil collapse." A quiet tension spread through the group, not from danger, but from realization. Frost suddenly gave a low, steady whine, longer than before, and then sat down facing the exact center point again, as if confirming the conclusion silently. Marcus stood slowly, his eyes moving from the scanned data to the ground itself. "This was not discovered," he said quietly. "This was waiting." The engineer adjusted the display again, zooming deeper into the layered imaging. "There appears to be an entry void beneath the main cavity," he added. "Something may be sealed further down." Jason exhaled slowly, processing the implication. "How long could something like that remain undetected?" he asked. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at Frost, who remained perfectly composed, his gaze unwavering. "Long enough," Marcus finally said, "for someone to forget it was ever there." The scanning equipment emitted another pulse, and this time the returning signal revealed a more defined shape beneath the irregular layers, something structured, aligned, and deliberate. The engineer leaned closer. "We have a geometric formation," he said quietly. "That is not natural." Frost shifted slightly, but did not move from his position. Marcus placed a steady hand on the dog's back. "Good boy," he whispered. The wind rolled across the field again, but it felt different now, less uncertain and more like passage over something that had been confirmed but not yet revealed. Jason stepped closer to Marcus. "We are going to have to go down there eventually," he said. Marcus nodded once. "Yes," he replied. "But now we know it is not empty." And as the team stood around the marked ground, the realization settled fully into silence. While Frost remained the only one who had never questioned that something beneath them had always been there. The field had shifted into a state of controlled stillness, where every piece of equipment, every person, and even the wind itself seemed to be waiting for the next revelation beneath the ground. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stood with Frost just behind the safety perimeter, his attention divided between the live imaging feed and the German shepherd who had never once looked away from the center point of the depression. The engineering team continued to refine the scan, layering deeper frequencies into the earth, each pulse revealing sharper definition beneath the surface. Corporal Jason Miller stood beside one of the technicians, arms crossed tightly as he studied the evolving structure on the display. "The geometry is becoming clearer," the lead engineer said, adjusting the resolution. "We are no longer looking at random collapse. There is intentional shaping below the void layer." Marcus stepped closer to the monitor again, his expression unchanged but focused. "Define intentional," he said. The engineer hesitated briefly. "Man-made, possibly reinforced. The structure appears to have defined edges, not natural erosion patterns." Frost suddenly shifted his stance, standing again, ears locking forward. The reaction was immediate and synchronized with a subtle change in the scan feedback tone. Jason noticed it first. "He is reacting to the equipment now," Jason said quietly. Marcus nodded once. "Or the equipment is finally matching what he already knew." A low tension settled across the group, not from fear, but from the realization that they were no longer discovering whether something existed, but what it was. The scan display shifted again, revealing a more coherent outline beneath the soil layers, something rectangular in formation, partially distorted, but still structurally consistent. The engineer leaned closer. "We are looking at a sealed chamber," he said slowly. "Possibly an underground storage unit or secured facility." Jason frowned. "There is no record of any facility in this sector." The engineer shook his head slightly. "Then it was never recorded, or it was deliberately removed." Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at Frost, who had once again returned to sitting position, perfectly still, as if anchoring himself to the exact point of certainty. The wind rolled across the field again, but weaker now, as if it too had begun to respect the space they were standing over. Marcus lowered his voice. "Can we access it safely?" he asked. The engineer glanced at the structural readings. "Not without excavation support," and full stabilization protocols. There is risk of further collapse if we breach the upper layer incorrectly. Jason exhaled slowly. So we are standing over something we cannot safely open yet, he said. Marcus nodded slightly. Correct. Frost suddenly let out a single low sound, not a bark, not a whine, but something in between, as if acknowledging the truth spoken aloud. Marcus placed a steady hand on the dog's back. You brought us here, he said quietly. Frost did not move. The engineering team continued refining the scan, and the display now clearly showed layered formations beneath the cavity, structured in alignment that suggested purpose rather than accident. The lead engineer pointed to a section of the image. There is an access point here, he said. Partially obstructed but structurally intact. Jason leaned in. That could be an entry hatch. Marcus studied it carefully. Or it could be sealed for a reason, he said. No one spoke after that. The weight of possibilities settled deeper than the scan itself. Frost stood again, slowly, and moved one step forward, stopping exactly at the center point once more, as if confirming that whatever lay beneath had not changed simply because it had been identified. Marcus looked at him and then at the ground. He is not guessing, Marcus said quietly. He is remembering. Jason turned to him. Remembering what? Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the earth beneath them as if expecting it to respond. Something that was never supposed to be forgotten, he finally said. And in that silence, with machines confirming what instinct had already declared, the field felt less like a training ground and more like the surface of a story that had been buried long before any of them arrived to uncover it. The entire field had become quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if the world itself had agreed to pause at the edge of revelation. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stood near the engineering station with Frost still positioned at the center line of the marked perimeter, the white German shepherd unmoving except for the slow rhythm of his breathing. The scanning systems continued their low-frequency pulses into the earth, and the live imaging display now showed a clearly defined structure beneath the soil, sharp enough that even non-specialists could recognize its deliberate geometry. Corporal Jason Miller stood slightly behind Marcus, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen as the implications settled deeper into understanding. The lead engineer adjusted the final calibration dial and leaned closer to the display. We have full outline confirmation, he said quietly. This is not a natural formation. This is a sealed construct with reinforced perimeter walls. Marcus did not take his eyes off Frost. Depth integrity, he asked. The engineer hesitated for a moment before responding. Stable enough for limited access, but any disturbance to the upper layer without controlled entry could destabilize the surrounding soil. Jason exhaled slowly. So we are looking at something intentionally buried and preserved, he said. Marcus nodded once. Yes. Frost suddenly stood again, his posture alert but calm, then turned his head slightly toward Marcus as if awaiting instruction that only the two of them understood. The connection between man and K9 felt different now, no longer investigative but confirmational, as if the dog had already completed a task that humans were only beginning to comprehend. Marcus stepped closer to the edge of the marked zone and looked down at the ground. Prepare controlled access protocol, he said to the engineering lead. The engineer nodded and immediately began coordinating equipment adjustments. Jason moved to assist, signaling for additional support units to secure the perimeter. The field expanded into organized activity, but at the center of it all, Frost remained still, watching the exact point beneath them. Marcus knelt beside him. You brought us here for a reason, he said quietly. Frost did not move. A faint vibration from the scanning system passed through the ground again, and this time the display revealed something more detailed beneath the primary structure. A secondary layer of reinforcement, aligned with precision that suggested deliberate construction rather than environmental formation. The engineer pointed to the screen. There is a dual-layer system, he said. Outer structural shell and inner compartmental space. Jason stepped closer, studying the data. That is not standard military field construction, he said. Marcus remained silent for a moment. Then he said, it was never meant to be standard. Frost gave a low, controlled breath, almost like acknowledgement. The wind across the field shifted again, but now it felt distant, as if the space above the structure had become separate from the rest of the environment. Marcus looked at the engineering team. When can we access it safely? The engineer checked his equipment once more. With proper reinforcement and excavation protocol, we can begin partial access preparation immediately. Full entry will require stabilization support, but initial opening is possible under controlled conditions. Jason looked at Marcus. We are actually going to open it, he said quietly. Marcus nodded. We did not come this far to stop at confirmation. Frost stepped forward again, placing himself at the exact center point, then lowered his head slowly, as if marking the threshold between known ground and what lay beneath it. Marcus placed a hand on Frost's shoulder. Stay with me, he said softly. Frost remained steady. The engineering crew began positioning the first stabilization anchors around the perimeter, and the field shifted again into structured motion, cables, sensors, and support frames forming a controlled boundary around the unknown. Jason checked the last readings and then looked at Marcus. Whatever is down there, he said. It has been waiting a long time. Marcus looked at the ground one final time before responding. Or waiting for the right moment to be found. Frost did not move, and as the preparation continued, the silence over the field deepened, not with uncertainty, but with the quiet understanding that what lay beneath them had already been there long before any of them arrived, and now it was about to be seen. The field had reached a level of stillness that felt almost unreal, as if every movement, every breath, and every sound had been carefully reduced to its most essential form. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stood at the edge of the controlled access zone with Frost positioned just ahead of him. The white German shepherd now calm in posture but unwavering in attention, his eyes fixed on the exact center point where all measurements, scans, and preparation had converged. The engineering team had completed stabilization placement around the perimeter, and the final readings now confirmed a reinforced structure beneath the earth, fully enclosed and intentionally sealed. Corporal Jason Miller stood beside Marcus, watching as the lead engineer gave a final confirmation signal to the equipment crew. All structural supports are active, the engineer said. We can proceed with controlled entry protocol. Marcus nodded once, his focus never leaving the ground. Frost took one slow step forward, then stopped again, as if marking the exact threshold of transition between known surface and hidden depth. Jason adjusted his position slightly, eyes scanning between Frost and the access team. This is actually happening, Jason said quietly. Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at Frost and then at the earth beneath them. It has been happening long before we arrived, he said finally. The engineering crew began the final phase of preparation, securing descent lines and reinforcing anchor points. The atmosphere shifted from observation to action, but without urgency, as if everyone understood that whatever lay beneath would not be rushed. Frost suddenly lowered his head and exhaled slowly, then sat directly at the center point once more. The movement was precise, deliberate, and final, as if confirming that the moment of discovery had arrived. Marcus knelt beside him and placed a steady hand on his back. Stay with me, he said quietly. Frost remained still. The lead engineer approached Marcus. We are ready for initial descent, he said. Controlled opening will allow visual confirmation of the upper chamber. Marcus gave a single nod. Jason stepped closer, tightening his gloves. I will go with the first team, he said. Marcus looked at him briefly. Stay within line of communication, he replied. Jason nodded. The descent rig was secured, and the first inspection unit prepared at the edge of the opening zone. Frost stood again at that exact moment, his posture shifting slightly forward, as if sensing the change before it happened. The ground team carefully initiated the controlled opening sequence, and a faint mechanical sound rose as stabilization systems adjusted pressure around the sealed structure beneath the surface. Marcus watched in silence as the access point was gradually prepared. There was no collapse, no sudden shift, only a slow and deliberate unveiling of something that had remained untouched for an unknown length of time. Frost stepped closer to Marcus, pressing slightly against his leg, not for direction, but for proximity. Marcus looked down at him. You were never reacting to the ground, he said softly. You were responding to what was inside it. Frost did not move. The engineer signaled that the initial visual access would be available within moments. Jason stood at the edge of the entry point, looking down into the prepared opening. Visibility is limited, he reported, but there is structure below, intact. Marcus stepped forward slowly until he stood beside Jason, both of them looking into the opening that revealed only darkness and depth. Frost remained behind them, perfectly still, as if no longer needing to leave because the destination had already been confirmed. The engineer spoke again. "We are ready to proceed with internal imaging." Marcus nodded once. "Proceed." And as the first light descended into the sealed space below, the entire field above remained silent, not in uncertainty, but in the quiet recognition that something long hidden had finally begun to reveal itself.